Well, now we will start this second step in the meeting, these stakeholder sessions. Let me say, just in case some of you didn't pay attention to this, that today we have a social event and then a social dinner. It will be an interesting thing. It's my opinion that it will be amusing and pleasant, the show that we have prepared, the music and dance, etc. So if some of you have not alerted the people of the organization, if you want to come to attend this activity, please say something afterwards. Having said this, I come to the session. Now is the session about creativity, and now we have larger public or participants of this dialogue. So I think that we can extend our considerations of the other day. The idea is that at the beginning there will be some summary of what has been said from the part of the academics first, and some ideas of what was also contributed by stakeholders in the sessions yesterday. But those sessions were not plenary, were parallel, so for many of you will be a new thing, these comments that we have gathered. Well, so starting with this, perhaps I invite Matthias, who will do this summary of main points or main ideas in the papers.
Of academics and
Okay, so.
So I'll summarize the contribution of partners and academic stakeholders from the thematics fields 6 and 5 from the X3 related with creativity for the academic session held yesterday afternoon. So the objective of yesterday's session was to identify issues and problematics to assets in these stakeholder sessions. So in the thematic field 5, creativity and identity, there were two presentations. The first one was the presentation by Arturo, Rodríguez, Morató, and I. The title of our presentation paper is How Does Cultural Diversity Contribute to Cultural Creativity? The main aim of our paper is to identify trends, problematics, gaps, and limits of academic and non-academic knowledge related to the relationship between cultural creativity and diversity. So in the first part of the article, we have identified studies addressing the issues of diversity and cultural encounters of specific cultural phenomenon linked to the process of hybridization in different areas of cultural creations. In the second part of our analysis, we have identified academic and non-academic literature addressing the issues of diversity and cultural creativity in two specific territorial frameworks, the city and Europe. And we have seen the academic studies examine the first part of this article of our presentation are mainly focused on processes of cultural encounters taking place in complex social environments characterized by high levels of diversity, on their configuration, dynamic, and especially on their effects in terms of hybrid identity and cultural productions. By contrast, in the second part of our articles predominate the academic and non-academic studies that analyze diversity and what it can generate in terms of economic development, urban regeneration, social cohesion, and mobility. The main deficit of knowledge regarding the relationship between cultural diversity and cultural creativity in Europe lies in the disconnection between distant kind of approach and literatures. The second presentation was made by Nikos Pastarchiadis. The title of his presentation was Multicultural Art and Cultural Citizenships, A View from Australia. The main aim of his paper is to understand the complexity of multiculturalism in the ground of level of cultural production beyond the mainstream of political discourse of fear. For this purpose, Papastarchiadis examined the novels of Christos Tsiolkas, it's okay, to understand the specific life world of Australian multiculturalism. Nikos highlights that the phenomenon of migration, the policies on multiculturalism, and the cosmopolitan worldwide in everyday life are not separate files of study, but that they are deeply interconnected. Also, Nikos points out some methodological change related with this kind of approach, the necessity of academic studies that combine qualitative and quantitative approach, an empirical and theoretical point of view, and the necessity to rethink the relationship between multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. To Papastarchiadis, this will require a reformulation of perspectives that's previously separate or our understanding of multiculturalism and migration as matter of national settlement from the open-ended reflection of cosmopolitanism and as a word of making activity. In respect of the thematics field 6, creative and heritage, there was 2 presentations also. The first one was made by Philip Schlesinger. The title of his presentation was Creative Europe, Culture, Economy and Policy in the Union European. The main of Schlesinger paper is to understand how creativity, economic policies navigates tension between culture and economy. To understand this relationship, he focused on the EU approach to culture, especially the framework of program of Creative Europe, constructed for the field of cultural policy from 2014 and 2020. In his paper, Schlesinger first outlined the range of cultural activity undertaken by the EU. Second, discussed key aspects of audiovisual policy and its present implication in the context of international trade. And third, he considered how the EU developed cultural and creativity industry policy, incorporating an explicit economics and market-oriented conception of culture. As concludes, Schlesinger pointed out cultural policy has been harnessed to economic purpose, but also variously building identity, citizenships, and community. Second, a creative economy thinking has given current EU strategy an emphatic economic orientation in the line with enhancing the Union's competitive position in international trade and the connection between the discourse of creativity with the digital economy. The second presentation on this thematic field was made by Volker Krisber. The title of his presentation was A Critique of Creative City Concept from a Sustainable Perspective. So the main aim of Krisber's presentation is to demonstrate the weakness of creative city discourse. His paper shows why the creative city really is a sustainable city. He started to point out some weakness of Florida discourse about creative class and creative city and demonstrate why Florida concept about creative city is unsustainable. Volker in his paper gives 4 reasons for explaining why Florida concept of creative city is unsustainable. First, his concept economic growth, contrast economic growth and social evolution. Second, his concept of contrast the idea of winner take it all with a solidarity with the weakest. Third, it prefers weak ties against strong ties. And fourth, it juxtaposes homogenized plug-and-play neighborhoods and urban diversity. Finally, Volker highlights alternatives for a sustainable and creative urban development related with ecological resilience, social equitable, and intercultural vibrant modes of life. It's okay.
Thank you, Matthias. So now Jordi Alomar will say something about what the stakeholders in other sessions have said about this.
Yes, I will go really to the very hot topics that were discussed in the session yesterday. In the first session, creativity and identities, the main... is it okay? Working. Is it working now? Okay, sorry. Good morning. One of the main issues discussed yesterday in the creativity and identity session was about innovation and creativity being accepted as a paradigm of progress, growing criticism of this issue. Emerged some problems with definitions of cultural creativity. Maybe the concept of cultural creativity is less developed than other concepts. Here raised a very interesting question. How can public institutions provide spaces for radical creative thinking to flourish? Another issue in this session was about emphasis on processes. Cultural creativity as an environment where creative processes can really emerge. The third question or topic managed in that session was about connectivity limitations in rural areas or outside big urban centers, and how creativity still tends to move toward larger cities. What do we miss by only focusing on urban areas? In the second session about creativity and heritage session, the main topics discussed by stakeholders were about the importance of indicators for managing information and explaining to policy-making institutions how culture can be valued. The importance of making partnerships and platforms for these partnerships with other sectors was also mentioned as a really useful topic to be discussed in this session. On the other hand, the role of civil society in culture was a topic that we think that should be discussed in this session, and as well the need for a holistic understanding of heritage and for it to be seen as more of a process. We really need to understand how to value heritage. The economic side is much better understood and used than the social side. That's everything. Thank you. So,
Okay, so I think we can
start this.
open this enlarged discussion. The idea is perhaps on the one hand there are people here that were not because you were perhaps in other sessions, in other related to other axes of the project, and you can perhaps add or some comments to these ideas, to these points, to these topics. And then the goal of the session is to assess the relative importance of these different concerns, these different topics, because we want to progress towards a selection afterwards and tomorrow to a selection of specific topics for working on them in the second phase, I remind you. So perhaps we can first of all open discussion by people who have not participated in those sessions and perhaps have some ideas to add or some comments to make to these first ideas. Some, yes?
Is it possible to project your summaries or something if we didn't follow? Because it's hard to know what to respond to.
We have no prepared slide.
Yeah. Okay.
If we went in the sessions, it's hard to know what the is there.
I don't know if
No,
you
we
have.
have no
I'm
slide
sorry.
of this
I'm afraid it's
because
not
summarized
possible.
yesterday. I put
Well,
in
you have the papers. Perhaps you have taken some note on the papers. I don't know.
Maybe we could start inviting the practitioner stakeholders that were present yesterday in our session and underline the main topics discussed and start the discussion from that point of view. I don't know if you agree, Cornelia and Carol and Santiago. I don't know where he is. Hi. And maybe start a discussion from your views of these topics.
My intervention was long yesterday.
I know it. So I'm sure you can talk much better than us about this.
Is it possible to start again?
I know.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Can we maybe introduce ourselves?
Sure,
Can we-
sure.
Yeah. Cornelia.
Mm.
Cornelia Dümke, Culture Concepts. I'm from Berlin. Yes. I think what we just yesterday discussed is part of the broader debate, namely a long debate on culture and economy, and now in a different neoliberal context as we are just now. And this was my critical intervention to what you mentioned here. What is the situation today?
It helps you.
Okay, so
Exactly.
we have spent 40 years to discuss culture and economy as binaries or binaries. And I think this of course, is not true. We refuse today to see how these is interlinked, culture and the economy, and even creativity within this, and innovation within this context. So this is a broader context we are in. So, and my question for this debate now is from which perspective we discuss creativity and innovation, which is not the same in my understanding, but there are of course linkages between. And do we discuss this from the culture policy perspective here in the room, or do we discuss this from a narrower art perspective? So this is my question to you.
Yes, hello. I'm Ulrike Meinhof from the University of Southampton, and I'm only an advisor here, so I don't have any paper to contribute. But and I also came very late because my plane got in very, very late last night. So forgive me if I'm saying something that is completely outside of what you're interested in. But I'm from a British perspective, even though I'm German, I very much represent here the British perspective. We have our main struggle at the moment as an academic is to build this bridge between the so-called activists, you know, the people out there on the general public, and those of us who are academics and who are kind of formulating the cultural policy, but also create the sort of projects on which we are working. And the big word for us is impact. We are all worried about impact in the UK. We have to show that our work as academics in the cultural field has an impact and an effect to the outside world. So now people who are the so-called stakeholders are hot properties. You know, we all look for them because we all need you desperately in order to show that we have this fantastic impact. And I have my own version of it because I've been very lucky in working with artists for a very long time as an academic. So I had lots of impact, but most of my colleagues are kind of tearing their hair out. And I wondered whether this is part of your agenda, because I mean, you are ideally placed to critique some of these notions. Because I mean, I think if you have on one hand a bunch of stakeholders and on the other hand a bunch of academics, then it's very, very difficult actually to create this interface, because we have a different language, we have different conditions of work, we have different purposes. Even just to get an academic to talk is fine because our salary continues. Many stakeholders need to take a day out from their work in order to participate if they're artists. So there are all sorts of structural issues, but there are also artistic issues and creative issues. So I wonder whether at what point in your debates this might become a real issue to think about, because I think best of all it would work bottom up rather than top down, you know, as a kind of genuine interface between people who like to work together. Sorry, this is very long, but I've taken my opportunity for my first intervention.
I think that was a fantastic. Oh, my name is Nairi Blankenberg. I'm a consultant in the cultural sector for mainly museums, very practical practitioner. And I would like to say thank you very much for that comment, because I would certainly endorse that. To me, if I guess there was one issue in terms of academics and stakeholders, or whatever you call them, working together, it would be an issue of communication, actually. And I think that that's a really important issue, because I think, for example, when I think of all these papers produced here today, which are extremely useful for me in my daily work, but it requires a huge amount of mental effort for me to understand it, to access it, to understand the frameworks, to figure out how they're applicable, and to figure out how I can use it. And I'm talking, I guess, not just these papers, but when I think of the body of work that academics create around these issues that I work with every single day, I find them extremely difficult to use. I can't understand the websites. I don't understand the language. I need a glossary. I can't use it. And I know that that maybe seem like a kind of non-academic or an issue that we're not talking about today, but in order for me to even be able to use it, to be able to measure impact, I have to understand it and I have to access it. And to me, there is a bit of a disconnect, and I think that actually is quite an important issue.
Okay.
Philip Schlesinger, University of Glasgow. Just to respond to that last comment, when we were discussing the next phase yesterday, not in plenary, this is precisely the point you make was one that came up, you know, that there is really a need to think about how we communicate our findings and their accessibility. And there are, of course, there are different audiences that we're speaking to. You know, when academics publish in journals, they're speaking to one particular kind of audience, but that really doesn't mean, I think, that there is some kind of incapacity of translatability into other ways of presenting the work. And I think it's a very reasonable request, actually, from the point of view of stakeholders, a term I do not like, I have to say, but we have them. It's very reasonable to ask for the work to be presented in ways that are comprehensible and usable without any sort of loss. I think it's a gain if we can do that. So I would certainly endorse that, and I think we need to think about how this project takes that forward, because the central idea really is to produce usable ideas that have an influence. And you know, if we're going to have a sensible discussion here today and tomorrow, we must try to do that. And I think that certainly the package of papers that people have been given is a demanding package. I can't say it was. Yeah, well, you get your test before you leave the room, Mark. I think, you know, anyone would say there's quite a lot to chew through there. You know, whether this is the academic reading academic papers or anyone else. So we have asked a lot of people, I think, in the initial stage. I hope we can, in a way, not let that be an obstacle now, and just get on with trying to find the common ground.
Yes.
Volker Kirchberg. I was one of the presenters yesterday, actually directly after Philip, and I object a little bit to the dichotomy of there are the academics who live in their ivory tower, who write complicated papers, and nobody in the practitioner's side will ever use what the academics find out. And on the other side, we have the practitioners who know the applied or the non-value of non-applied work, and therefore there's this chiasm between these two sides. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I felt that this is something that I hear all the time, and I object to it because I see myself as an empirical sociologist. I do empirical social research, and whenever I do my sociological research in this interface of arts and urban development, I see that it is necessary to talk to the artists, to talk to the industrial persons, to talk to the urban planners, and to include their work and their ideas in a specific way that deals more with what are the causes of our activities in this field, what are the consequences of our activities in this field, and therefore we also use some theoretical background. This sounds more complicated than I try to be, because I'm working empirically. Therefore, I see the difference not as a difference, but as supplementary, a complementary idea. Let me just finish, I'm not done yet. I'm not done yet. And in addition, I see on the other hand, that's what I want to also add. On the other hand, I see the same happening here that I see in this field of creativity and urban planning and the arts all the time. There are certain groups who live in their own language, who use their own language, who live in their own life worlds, and who have sometimes problems to, so do I, to translate my own thoughts into the life worlds of other people in the other field. This might be between corporations, it might be between and artists, it might be between business planners and real estate developers and creativity personnel, whatever that means, creativity workers. But to find a translation between these different groups is something that is important to as an objective of these meetings, of these workshops. So just as kind of a sermon into the direction that we should not split ourselves into these two groups, but to see that there's a lot of relationship linkage between these two groups. Do you want to react directly to me, I think?
I'd just like to continue this relationship in a slightly different way. I've been part of a number of groups, research groups in Australia, which have worked with industry partners and the cultural sector in what we call a methodological feedback system. And we begin all these projects using the terminology that George Marcus uses in his fieldwork by referring to people as epistemic co-partners. So there's an equality of knowledge production and an equality of responsibility for knowledge communication between all partners that is established as a first principle in the research process. So maybe that's a technique that needs to be emphasized. I think it was implicit in our discussion yesterday. And it certainly produced, for me, a very stimulating but interesting point of tension, because there was a different orientation between the academic and the stakeholder approaches. And that's what I think is coming about. It's not so much a tension over the comprehensibility of the vocabulary, because I take Volkner's point precisely. There was no dispute about, oh, what do you mean? It was more about how do we use it? And that was because as academics, I think both Arturo and myself, we adopted a viewpoint that was to say, what is the widest possible category that can capture the phenomena that we're pursuing, or what is the most generative technique that can highlight the activities that are already underplay? And I say already underplay, and this emphasizes the urgency, which is also another issue which I think we need to think about both conceptually and methodologically, is timing, because the urgency was about communication patterns at three different life worlds. The life world of the academic, the life world of the policymaker, and the life world of cultural activity on the ground. And in all cases, there is a translation process going up and down, but also out. And I think the challenge for us was to see how the broadening of scope that the academic provided and the request for precision and clarification and some degree of standardization for applicability purposes in policy should not be seen as a sort of contradictory or antagonistic, but as part of the sort of dialogic process in working through what is actually happening on the ground. So I think that would be an important activity to grasp, because one of the phenomena we actually noticed and we all agreed on was that the communication patterns that occur in the context of cultural difference is that the idea of belonging no longer conforms to any state-centric categories, because of the communication patterns are making people find networks which are exceeding any kind of national boundary. However, the policy frameworks and our inherited intellectual traditions often reinforce national categories. So that was a critical point of tension that needed to be addressed also.
I don't think there's a tension, and I don't think there's a dichotomy, actually. It was more or less a plea. And I suppose in terms of your comment, in terms of I'm glad that you do empirical research, but do you go back to those people with your findings? I mean, fine, we talk to whoever to do our research, but then when we come with whatever conclusion do we go back to them? And that is, to me, that is the critical issue, actually. It's that we desperately need the work that you're doing, and we desperately need you to be doing it, but we need to be able to access it. We need it not in a PDF. We need it not stuck in a journal we have to pay for. We need it optimized for search engines so we can Google it. I mean, there was a study in the US, very interesting, over the last 6 months, and I'm not American, I'm Canadian, but it said, how do most directors of museums get their information? And the number one way they got their information was not journals, was not conferences, was not forums, it was through the media. And I think just that study in and of itself was extremely interesting, because when you think of who's making the decisions and where they actually get the information from which to make their decision and where they find it, it's not necessarily in the areas where that information is being published. So I don't think there's any tension at all. I think we absolutely have to work together, and I guess that's why I'm sticking on this communication point, because I see it as a serious barrier in us being able to work together to confront what some of the incredibly mutual issues are between practitioners and stakeholders and academics, whatever that dichotomy is.
Thank you. I'm Anna Trindafilido. I'm a partner in the project. I'm an academic. I want first to subscribe to what Volker said and also qualify a bit what Ulrike said. There's a lot of academics that are as precarious as artists. There's very few of us that have these salaries that keep going while we're having a workshop. And that relates also to your comment right now. It's not always possible. Because, I mean, it's not always possible to go back to the people you study. And I would revert your question to you. You ask us not to send you the PDFs. What about if I ask you not to send me the museum exhibition, but to write it in a PDF and send it to me so I can understand? So put yourself, I mean, the researcher does not necessarily have to do all of the extra mile. We have to do both of us. So our way of communicating is through writing, through workshops, through discussing. And not always our findings are directly relevant to what a practitioner does, but maybe we can say some things that may be relevant and or may open up new avenues to the creative things that you're doing or to the dissemination and interaction work that you're doing. But certainly we cannot become curators or we cannot become artists, and I'm sure the artists and the curators cannot become researchers, and we have different roles to play. Precisely and I would like really to emphasize this, that the laws, if not, perhaps, I mean, I don't know the statistics of it, but at least half of the so-called academics today live in very precarious job situations, just like artists. And this is both a positive, creative thing, but it can also, of course, be a negative thing. So I think this is something that actually relates to the question of European cultural policy, to the extent that European culture and European research policy tries to complement the national or the regional cultural and research policy in creating avenues for discussion and in creating funding for discussion. So that's why we're here today. That's why we're all having our expenses covered to be here today.
I think that the three, because there are the...
Yes.
I will introduce myself, maybe? Yeah?
You can introduce yourself, okay. Please.
Luis Bonet, University of Barcelona. I think that there are three stakeholders: academics, the professionals, and the politicians. And the three follows different systems of obtaining information and to ask themselves key questions. If we analyze politicians in general, they prefer to ask to consultant corporations their own pieces of research needed to take decisions. In general, they have problems with academics. And they have problems with academics basically for two reasons. First of all, because we, the academics, the questions that worries us are probably larger than the kind of interest they are interested to know. And they prefer to have, in a short term, direct answers to their questions. And the questions are very pragmatic in general. Of course, there are many exceptions. Professionals, as well as politicians, is true. They read what media says. And sometimes media has very superficial approaches. Some other times could have better approaches. But there is, of course, a border here. And I think it's our responsibility to try to do both good research work and to organize seminars, courses, and use, of course, Twitter and other social network platforms to try to explain the results, not only about our research, but also about the research that our students are doing. And that's, I think, one of our obligations. But we have to understand that each group has their own logics. Professionals are interested in our results when our results helps them to take decisions, to be more strategical. And we have to understand that this is their interest. And because we have, many of us, we have students coming from the professional world, I think we have to translate our thoughts, our results, to what could be interest. And that, I think, is our obligation. But that doesn't mean we have to stop to do in deep research. I think both things are interconnected and one fits the other one. It's true that academic journals are not written by, except by the academic world, and this is a problem. And we are evaluated through this, and not through our job as diffusers of knowledge. But I think we need to convince all sides that we are in the same ecosystem, and this is a joint learning process.
Valerie? Sorry.
Bad luck. Karol Fruhauf, from Baden, Switzerland. I represent here Resartis, which is an umbrella organization of artists in residence programs worldwide. We have 500 members. I would offer you a reflection. I live from a consultancy company I am running. I'm a software engineer and consultant in software engineering. Beside that, I run a residency in Slovakia, where I was born, and I'm in some other cultural foundation because I'm interested in culture as well. As a software engineer consultant, we have 2 rooms full of books. 80% of them I read, 20% of them I'm using in my daily practice. As a cultural man, running a residence and being in other foundations, I didn't have any need until now to look in any books. We have one store above our office, which is our flat, also full of books. Maybe it is saying more about me than about the academia. And I'm quite sure, because I know a couple of people here now, that I will be curious what they are writing about, and I will maybe find some books on Amazon or somewhere else, and maybe they will help me. But I am quite sure that I am not very exceptional in this, and there are many people in the field who maybe don't have the need for the output you are producing. So my question is, who is your target audience?
Yeah, Gabriele Mazza, formerly Council of Europe, United Nations. So I suppose this places me in the category of what? I don't know. Stakeholders. Yeah. Stakeholder, policy people, policy concerned people. So I think it's very simple. You know, the academic world, the world of academia and research and so forth, is split into 2 parts. Those who know how to communicate outside of it and those who do not. If you want to communicate such a situation like this with people who do not belong to it, then you have to avoid self-referential language, style, and so forth, and you have to apply the skills that you may or may not have in communicating in a language that is understandable, usable, applicable, and relevant. This split is made evident by the papers that have been produced for this workshop, which are all excellent, but some are not as easily readable as others. So it is possible that some papers, and quite a few of them, as a matter of fact, both long and short, were perfectly, in my opinion, it's a personal opinion, perfectly usable for the purpose of the workshop. Others were not. So it's just not a question of meeting in the middle and we will be living happily together. I think that this capacity, this ability to communicate outside of one small environment, professional environment, is a necessary skill on the part of academics, as it is on the part of policymakers and so forth, to read a reasonably sophisticated academic article or report.
Okay. Valerio.
Can I? Sorry. No, I just think, I mean, can we not all agree that there needs to be a common form of communication that bridges all the different worlds? I mean, to me, there's no dichotomy, there's no tension, there's no nothing. Simply, it's an observation that communication is important. We all have value in this conversation, and we need to create a tool through which everyone can get the value that they need. Can we agree on that, if that's what we do at these conferences?
I don't know. I would like to make a general comment. Do you know what?
Introduce yourself. Introduce yourself.
Oh, excuse
please.
me. Jean-Louis Fabiani, I'm from CEU. I'm a sociologist. But an academic today is not what you think. I have been working with artists for 35 years, so I've published about 10 or 12 books with Pierrick Sorin, Bernard Plossu, and others. And I've been communicating with artists, and if you read what contemporary artists do, they are much more obscure, very often, than academics. And of course, they are not forced to communicate. But, and they quote again and again Jacques Rancière, Giorgio Agamben, and try to communicate with these artists, and you will see. So, being asked and being lectured, I think it's a part of a ritual, you know, that you academics live in an ivory tower, and okay, you don't communicate, and we want usable things. And okay. It's much more complicated because we have been communicating for 40 years. This is not a new topic. So we have links with a lot of stakeholders. Maybe the choice of stakeholders is wrong in this project. I don't know. We have to think about it. But I've been also, because academic now, as Anna told you, have many lives because they have to find jobs. And for a few years I was in the cultural administration of France. So I know also how to talk to policymakers. I went to Brussels many times, so it's not new for us. So please accept that we use some vocabulary that you are not acquainted with, that you do not use every day, and accept that you spend a few hours, okay, quitting your own specific world to explore new things. Because we talk about creativity ad nauseam, and when we ask a little effort, okay, to be creative, so to get out, to think out of the box, and to discover new things, even academic, of an academic sort, it becomes too difficult, okay? So we are not going to provide usable tools because it's not our business. We are going, I think, to, because this is not even applied research. Policymakers have to do policy. We are not to substitute for them. And artists, we are not artists, as Anna said. So we are not going to become artists. And there are, of course, tension. Every social thing is in tension. So this is not the problem. We are not going to change, especially me at my age. I don't see any possibility. So either you say bye-bye to me, or we change this type of discourse. I'm not sure that this type of thing that I have heard, I mean, for 45 years now, is very useful to our debate.
Yeah. I want to say something before continuing this discussion that I think is very necessary and very important. It was not planned to speak about this, but I think that it's clear that it's necessary. And it's because from the beginning I say this is a process and we want to progress to find a way to really develop a dialogue. And this has certain difficulties, that's true and it's obvious. And perhaps some prejudice also that make difficult for us, for one kind of people or other kind of people to approach the other. And we are learning. In this, for example, in this case, I realized that it would have been a good idea to put a list of topics, but sorry, we didn't. Next time, probably the next stakeholder session, perhaps we will have the capacity to do this, and this will help to examine point by point specific issues, and this will do things easier. Anyway, what I think is important is that we all understand that this discussion is a positive discussion, one. Then that our goal is, and our methodology too, because our intention perhaps is hard at the beginning to have all these papers that are so extensive, etc., and demanding, but we thought that this could be and should be the point of departure, only the point of departure, because in all these processes of dialogue, these social platforms that have been developed in other fields, always this is the point of departure. We must have in mind that the goal, the end goal of this dialogue is finally to produce research agendas in this field. It is not to produce specific policy programs or whatever. It's something related to but something that could be, and I think all of you, if are committed to this project, understand and agree with this, that this can be relevant to the real field of cultural activity. But this should be started in some way, and it's quite logic that the first step is to try to look what has been done and what is the knowledge accumulated on these issues in order to imagine other views. Immediately, our intention was, and we must improve the way to do this, but our intention was to open a space for stakeholders, give your views apart from this starting point of the papers, to give your views, to give your critical views also on the papers, but apart from that, to give your views. In sum, I think that it is good to continue this conversation, perhaps to devote the rest of the time of this session to clarify things and to try to find a way collectively to make more clear and in a more useful way the different points for being discussed, or find a way to advance the dialogue. That's the idea.
Can I? Yeah.
Sorry.
I have a wish and a comment. And my wish is to come back to a fruitful debate we had yesterday. And the fruitful debate we had, and it was working from my experience and yours and others also, you too. So that we should provide a meta debate. And my comment to this is that what is experience here, which is the general approach to bring together people from different silos to talk with each other. This happens currently in very different settings, and it's a phenomenon that it's happening now. And there are reasons. We should talk about the reasons why it happens now. I think one reason is that we have lost something. And I will make reference to the idea of the Bauhaus, the famous Bauhaus. It's a term, you know, where art and science were together. And it was in the 20s. And then they lost the coherence. And I think to come into a coherence again with science, with art, this is now the situation. So I would offer you the idea of the philosophy and the strategy of the Bauhaus for this meeting.
Okay. We've probably, Gerard Delante, I'm a sociologist at the University of Sussex. We've probably moved on already from the earlier discussion about academics as poor communicators, and just wanted to make 2 points before we despair about academics' capacity for communication. First of all, the everyday world of most academics, such as myself, is that we are doing something as implausible as teaching, and that does involve being good at communication. And secondly, most academics work in interdisciplinary contexts, and it's quite a challenge engaging in debates between different disciplines. And I think a lot of academics have learned to improve their communication, go beyond a narrow disciplinary context, and maybe that could be a basis. That's obviously a problem, a real problem in communicating outside academia, but I'm not sure it's entirely because academics can't communicate.
Okay.
Mark O'Neill, Policy Director for the charity that runs arts, libraries, museums and sport in the city of Glasgow. I'm fascinated by how defensive some academics are being. What I heard was a plea for your extremely valuable work to be translated, and underlying all the papers is a need for translation across cultures, across domains, across hierarchies. So I think, and there are very practical suggestions, and there are good models in other domains. I'm thinking, for example, there's a health policy unit in Glasgow. Glasgow has some of the worst health in Western Europe, and they produce briefing papers for politicians. They summarize the academic research, and they explore the practical implications. It's a very rigorous process to simplify, as Philip said, but it can be done. But I assumed we would be working on that basis. I wanted to say some other things, if I can have a few minutes. For me, I'm a translator. We have 3,000 staff who run libraries and sports centres, and I speak to people like Philip and try and translate. But there's nothing so practical as a good theory. A good theory is incredibly powerful, and the politicians that people need to speak to are just enacting theories from 50 years ago, or what they read in the newspaper 2 weeks ago. So engaging with the theory is really important. But I think for the papers, it's the underlying theories that are missing, the assumptions. What we in publicly funded culture share with academics are things like a belief that truth is significant, that insight creates change. There's a deep romantic thing about human development. So there's a long history of aspiration and the Enlightenment, and there's all sorts of things happening here that are not made explicit, and it does connect with things like the Bauhaus, that there are very powerful, much higher level ideas that actually I think need to be articulated here. So there's a plea for the articulation of the fundamental values that underlie all of this. I'm rewriting the city's cultural policy at the moment, and we're using human rights, the right to culture. We're looking at Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, human capabilities. These are powerful notions that can be made simple enough to drive politics. And the other thing is a warning. If you don't do this, consultants will do it. I don't know what the case in Europe is, but in Britain, Demos, for example, have made a lot of money out of your ideas because they do the translation.
I agree. My name is Lars. I'm wearing two hats, actually. One is that I represent a network of higher arts education in Europe, almost 400 schools, from fine art to design, dance, theater. And my other hat is that I'm curating an art space in the Netherlands. So I'm having the very national Dutch perspective on the discussion, but I'm also having the rather broad perspective of a discussion at ELIA, which is very much about cultural and creative industries, about the impact for our students finding a job out there, having to prove themselves that they do have an economic value, that creativity does mean innovation, where at the same time schools would say, no, it's not only that, it's much broader, there's an intrinsic value of creativity and we have to defend that. So we are very split up in our attitude within the art schools. On the one hand, wanting to go to that Bauhaus idea, which is the autonomous artist that communicates in a modern world with all the other disciplines. And then when we try to realize that in incubators or hothouse environments where we artificially bring together the artists with the scientists and the others, we realize how hard it is to get that back into our thinking as a natural thing. So I'm absolutely with you on the plea that we miss something. At the same time, from my Dutch perspective, the whole cultural sector in the Netherlands is running behind the neoliberal paradigm, and at the one hand side condemning it collectively, at the same time trying to adjust their language in order to beat them with their own weapons, which gets into such a mindfuck. That now they are realizing, and those discussions are coming up slowly, like here, where they say, well, actually, no, we shouldn't talk about social or economic impact and defend our own raison d'être through their impact indicators. We have our own impact indicators, and what we as an art sector develop today is a wallpaper at IKEA tomorrow. So they can't understand it today, but tomorrow they all have it in their living room. But we realized that we lost a language in which to discuss with them on our terms. So in my view, what we are trying to do here, and that's why I'm so excited about the papers and the discussions to come, is to find a language which enables me again to lead a discussion to beat them. Mm-hmm.
I think that's an excellent. My name is Nikos. That's an excellent point that you've just made, Lars, and it comes back to the discussion that also Cornelia was saying in terms of getting on to the specifics of what was actually already occurring in yesterday's meeting. And the key request that was resoundingly coming to the academic from the stakeholder sector was, how do you measure the value? And what would be the criteria? And in its most precise way is, how would you operationalize that measurement criteria classificatory process in an indicator model. So the challenge, I think, now is to develop indicators, tracking devices, in other words, that come out of cultural values, not demographic, like how many people came through, or economic in what was the sort of financial turnover, etc. So you'd need to think about, and this might be something that the stakeholders can pass back to the academics as they work out, because in our models we've actually developed cultural indicators in our research framework. But we need to know also what it is that you value. And similarly, the institution might not have the same sense of what it values that is the same as the artist. Or other members of the public might value other things according to their cultural perspectives. So the indicator systems, quantitative as they are invariably going to be qualitative in their formulation. So that requires a lot of toing and froing and discussing to get to the point of what it is that you need to look for. So maybe we can use this time to talk about the things that we want to be measured.
Thanks. Luca from Culture Action Europe. I'm just stepping now because I think it's what you say makes sense, but I want to try to link it up to something else. It made sense to me. Okay. In my view, the issue today is to understand how experiences that we do impact on some, let's say, cultural elemental of the way we are as individual and collectivity. And I want to make an example. We have been built a society around the notion that competitivity is a fundamental cultural capacity, and not cooperation or curiosity, not empathy versus things. So if something should be measured, in my view, is how cultural experiences enable or not enable the development of this kind of basic capabilities towards something, then it's not said. And I go back to, I'm sorry, the man spoke about big theories. What is lacking in the paper and in the academic debate is the theory which is behind the departmentalized views. And this is essential because the whole civil society, whatever civil society is somehow challenged by the lack of elements that are capable to reunify discourses that are hyper-fragmented in different parts of the sector. We need theories, general theories, and the departmentalized analysis, which does not lead to something that creates a common picture, it's problematic. And it's not a great value for us, because it leads to do exactly what, to fall into exactly the fault that the cultural sector went into the past, is to adjust its own narrative in order to prove the validity of what they were doing segment by segment, or towards one theory, which was the economic. I do not agree with the intrinsic value of culture. I want to be clear. Culture has a value if it is intrinsic, meaning that there is another element in the relation which is not the object itself. It's the relationship that someone established with a creation. If there's no this relation, the object for me can be thrown away. But so the cultural sector itself needs to seriously reconsider its own point of view. The risk I see in the Netherlands is that in order to react to, I want no longer prove that I'm fitting with the indicators that are set by someone else on the basis of non-spoken theory. It leads to go back to a position it was 20 years ago, which say, okay, we are not the older of the truth, and we have to do whatever we want to do because this in the future would be, and this would be a disaster. So it's extremely important that theory within which you measure things, and the things for me that you have to measure are those that I was trying to mention before.
Does it work? Yes. Mercedes from InterArts. Just to pick up on what Luca has just said, I would like to give a concrete example of something that has recently happened that illustrates exactly what Luca has been talking about. It's the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030. We as a sector have been utterly incapable, although there has been a possibility of putting forward the idea of the importance of culture being included in the SDGs, but we have been incapable of providing exactly the theory needed to sustain that request. And we fell into the trap because policymakers, member states ask that that happens, of providing only quantitative elements, indicators, targets, etc. But to my understanding now, after 6 months that this has happened, although the agenda was approved only 4 days ago, it is actually that. The incapacity that we have as the sector, stakeholders in this case, to feed from the research, whatever is there, but in terms that it provides for, again, the theory that needs to sustain a demand, a request, a need, etc. But that is what has happened, and that happens at international level, not only in the Netherlands. It happens amongst the whatever 100 and I don't know how many there are member states at the United Nations. 194, tells me Gabriel. No, 189, I think it is. I'm not sure.
I think the important issue now is stakeholders. This is your demand. For you, this is the most important topic you are requesting, because when we decided about our topics of research, or when we advise our students, our PhD students about interesting topics, we might try to be in dialogue with you, and maybe, I don't know, we are able to help the stakeholders to answer this question. But I'm not totally sure this political issue is the most relevant. And I think that the kind of answer that we can give, it's an answer who needs a lot of collective reflection, because I'm quite sure in the artistic field, in the heritage field, there will be a lot of people who will have problems to a technocratical kind of answer, or and so it means that we need to work together and to dialogue together, listen different approaches to try to build something consistent. This is something that we can't do alone, the academic people. It's something that I think the networks can do alone. And I think what you just explained, in the sense that the sector is very weak and it's not able to compete with the other lobby groups in Brussels, is because in general we are quite individualistic as a sector. So it's not easy to build together something, and we don't have the resources. First of all, we listen to the idea that the academic world in this field is weak. It's weak because the academic fields, the traditional academic fields, sociology, anthropology, political science, economy, and so on, we are in the marginal sides on the main academic discussions. And for instance, in the particular case of cultural policy, if cultural policy or cultural economics is in some place, there are some teaching activity, it's because cultural management programs allow of this, but not general cultural political science or sociology. It's quite difficult. So it could have some exceptions, but not a lot. So I think that we need to work strong in this direction and think about what are the relevant issues. And I think I totally agree with your proposal before, in the sense that maybe we have to move the discussion to what are the key issues.
Can I?
Yes.
Can I then add in a dimension? I've only scanned the papers. My speed reading is not good. But identity, memory, community, these are important. But I think a missing issue is health and well-being. Again, my colleague was talking about data. There are very substantial epidemiological studies in Scandinavia about the positive health impact of cultural attendance, not art therapy, not intensive things. Just going to the cinema, live music and museums makes people live longer. And in terms of the values of cooperation and empathy, if you look at the major social issues of the next 20 years, social isolation is a huge issue, globally as big a health impact as smoking. So culture, and I know health and well-being is a neoliberal construct as well. It's about privatizing social impacts of health, but leaving all that, or engaging with all of that, cultural participation and health. And it goes back to my original plea for a holistic view of human beings and the role of culture in human life. And healthy life and social connection are big parts of culture. They're what culture is for. And I think that has to be part of the research agenda.
Okay.
Can I simply add on this? If we do not get rid of the idea that in order to, and it's here, in order to understand what are we talking, we look at the sector. The point is not the sector, it's the issue. It's what function culture has in human society. If you look at that, then even the fragility of a sector as a negotiator changed. Because it's not just a sector that is advocating for its own needs, but it has to be a coalition of citizens that demand for development of public sphere within which this function is essential, exactly for the motivation you're doing. And that's the basic. If we keep looking the things under the angle of how we do tell the story in relation to something that by itself, it defines an economic activity, we cannot achieve what we on the contrary need. We need to transform the whole things in an issue-oriented things. It's not sector-focused. And that can be done, because then that leads to a completely different set of alliances, and a completely, and you provide the general human theory which enable artists and ourselves to speak into, and then we can contribute to conversation this kind, which is no longer on the way we do things, but what's the function that we can play through what we do in society in order to improve human development.
Peter Wagner, EK, University of Barcelona. I have to start with two apologies. First of all, my voice doesn't function very well, but I hope you can understand me. And secondly, I have been hesitant to intervene into the discussion because I was not able to be here yesterday, so I only know about the background sessions through Matthias and Jordi's presentations. But at this moment of the discussion, I'm tempted to intervene because I think it is understandable, given that this is the first stakeholder session, as it is called, that a number of very general issues have come up. But I think maybe it is worthwhile at this moment, where there is half an hour of more time to discuss, to concentrate more specifically on creativity. Because I think otherwise we risk that when we talk about inclusion and memory, we will talk about the same things again, because they will emerge, or they are underlying relations between academics and stakeholders, all the issues we have been discussing until now. So that is my more procedural proposal for the remaining of the discussion. And given my absence yesterday, I cannot be very concrete, but I want to make one proposal which I think links to some of what Matthias was reporting, and maybe from the ongoing debate closest to what Lars and Luca have been saying. I think maybe the stakeholders have to confirm or deny that that is the case, but that what is really needed under this topic is to think about the specifics of creativity, of artistic creativity, or of creativity overall. There was, it seems, yesterday in the discussion a debate about innovation and creativity, and would it not be worthwhile to really try to distinguish these two categories? Is not innovation maybe usefully seen as something that does create, I now say, that does produce something new, that is what it's aiming at, but as something new that is, before it is being produced, rather well developed in the mind with a specific objective and a purpose. I mean, take one recent example which came to the press. In the car industry, they clearly knew exactly what they wanted before they knew exactly how they could develop a device that would detect emission testing. Now they knew that when they started this 10 years ago. They didn't know how to do it, so that's why it's called an innovation when they managed to do this to cheat the environmental protection agencies. That is innovation. It creates something new, but with a clear purpose and objective. Well, it's innovation. Whereas I suggest that we should distinguish that maybe from creativity as a kind of activity where one doesn't know what is being indeed created, not just produced as something new, where there is something open-ended, there is something that develops against the context and conditions, but doesn't have a purpose in the first instance. And then it may have a usefulness, as Lars was saying, in the second instance, not recognizable immediately, and it may be set into a broader understanding of what human beings are and what they need, as I understand Luca to be saying, but it is something much more open-ended. And this just as a proposal for discussion, maybe to see more generally, to devote the rest of the time to thinking about what creativity is and what it needs in our time. And secondly, more concretely, to see whether a distinction between innovation and creativity may not be a useful tool in that direction. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I have the mic. But just to clarify, so what are you asking for? A response to what is creativity? What's the question?
Yes.
No. And then.
And why? Do you see that as an important distinction?
Because.
No, I'm just asking. It's a completely legitimate question. Why would we need to do that?
Because
creativity is what artists do.
People do.
And it seems what you have to tell your stakeholders that what is at stake literally is to see what do conditions are creativity aid or why those conditions are not fulfilled. If that's not the stake,
As a, yeah.
fine, then we don't do it.
Okay. All right. No, I'm just trying to understand. I'm trying to respond to you in the interest of listening and conversation. It relates to actually the point I was going to make to support the idea of the indicators around health and well-being, but it was also around linking to education, I guess, if those are the indicators we want to look at, and the idea of skill building. I mean, I do subscribe to the idea that creativity is a skill that everyone can have, not just artists, and that there is actually a real value in trying to link together this discussion of creativity, not just to what is it, but to how it can be fostered, how it can be used, and how it can be developed across the educational spectrum.
Just a little supplement to what was said about innovation and creativity. I think we may want to put a focus in the future sessions and in the research on artistic research, which was a major debate in the last 10, 15 years in the academic and artistic arena. And I guess that there could be some interesting frictions with what you've just said, where creativity is seen as a research process by the artists with a set goal, which may not be achieved, but as opposing the empirical research, but on eyesight. So there are very interesting debates about it, and we could bring in intelligence about that, and that could be very useful for our discussion.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Ferdinand Richard. I am from Marseille. If I understood well, this meeting is funded by the European Union. So I may be wrong, but I would like to remind the political frame of this discussion. Europe is facing a choice, whether we put all the researcher, the creative people, the media, the decision makers in some golden triangle, or whether we create from any periphery in the European continent a source of knowledge and creativity. This is the very difficult decision our politicians have to do. Anything we discuss when we talk about civil society, about creativity, about cultural rights, I think the idea of cultural right is hanging around, but no one is really getting in. We have in France these days a very strong debate about whether we would adopt cultural rights or not. And this will be related to a very strong decentralization movement. So we are just at the edge of taking very important decisions on this political level, the Europe of nations versus the Europe of the, what we say in French, territoire, regional authorities. And I don't imagine that everything that is being said today here would forget about this political demand, because the meeting is funded by the European Union, and there is a political demand.
I would like to continue the point that Peter raised about the distinction between innovation and creativity, and also link it to the question that both Cornelia and I think were making about urgency, and why this distinction perhaps has some salience and grip in the political imagination right now. And I think also earlier we talked about the collapse of the avant-garde as a model, you know, in the sense that the authority of the artist as precursor is no longer, as a person who innovates and produces new visions that eventually society then adopts, that is no longer capturing or holding the authority it once had. So if you were to make an argument based on your value as an artist as a visionary in that sense, either in the open-ended way that you describe creativity, or even in the applied sense, the more purpose-driven model of innovation that you clearly differentiated, which I totally agree with. But the point is, either way, that authoritativeness has crumbled. Now that tells us that we're at an interesting juncture, and so we can't go back to old models to justify the value of art, and we can't simply then translate the old values of art in economic models, but we have to produce a new way of conceiving the other values of empathy, cooperation, curiosity, wonder, compassion, etc., which produce an open-ended vision of the world, that cosmopolitan vision, which is always creative as well. But we have to find new vocabularies and new conceptual frameworks to communicate those values, because I think this is what I think we're putting our finger on, is that the time now is telling us that the old models aren't working, even if the values haven't changed, which they won't, of course. But what has changed is the political authority by which we defined those values. I could talk extensively about how artists have tried to redefine themselves, but I think the political and policy and cultural agenda has actually found a point of convergence. That's why impact is perhaps so relevant.
Yeah, I would. Can I continue? Sorry.
No.
I can continue the idea on what you just explained a little bit more deeper. Yesterday, we were trying to identify what is behind the agenda of the creativity and innovation at different levels, national and at EU level. And of course, we put the finger on several dilemmas just now, obvious in the discourse and in the policy level also. For me, it seems to be very important in this context and not only to talk about new models, but also to really go deeper into this consideration of cultural creativity, what it means, what it really means. Namely, for me, it's an environment where other ways of doing things emerge. This is what artists do. Then, more than the end result, more related to a process of doing things. And more specifically, the innovation of which I speak is not focused on the product to install in the market, but rather to research and to create knowledge that can evolve along with processes, spaces, things, agents who take part. So, and this is a different approach than currently applied under many innovation and creativity agendas.
Thank you. I was wondering about the total change in our way of doing things, and maybe we should have started. It's a counterfactual, it's too late, but we should have started with the papers by the stakeholders, because they raised very important questions that we have missed. Maybe because we are trapped, as Nico said, in old frames about culture, and that we are not well equipped. That's what we say with Nasser in our paper. Well equipped to deal with the new forms, emerging forms, and that were not thought in either the classical avant-garde theory or in the legitimacy, cultural legitimacy theory, and so on. So we have, together with the stakeholders, to find why sociologists and anthropologists sometimes are very late, are behind the process. So I saw the notion of health, well-being, education, that of course is not as present as it should be in our papers, and the periphery and the territories that we mentioned with Nasser in our paper, maybe in a very abstract form, but I think it's very important, this issue raised by Ferdinand Richard, and maybe because we have lived many years in Marseille, Nasser and I, we are really thinking that it's absolutely central. But because we have to go on, I don't want to be long. I think that we were looking yesterday for new topics, and I think a part of what has been said by the stakeholders could be integrated in the 12 topics that Gerard mentioned at the beginning of the session, to refocus what we are doing, because of course we are in I am absolutely, I'm not totally surprised, but the stakeholders always mention the necessity to go back to a form of general theory, and of course in the last 40 years we have witnessed the decline or the end of the master narratives and big narratives about the history and society, and now it seems that people, professionals, need something that would be more unified. This is something that I'm really struck by.
Just to add very briefly to, thank you, Jean-Louis. I could have two. Why not? Two's better than one. Yeah. I think there's also another thing that's coming through, which is actually a different way of talking about the legitimacy of culture. I think it's not there is a demand, if you like, which is kind of interesting and to some extent surprising to, if you like, refound the way we think about culture. But it's also because so much of the debate about culture has been about what it is legitimate to recognize, and I think in the past 3 decades certainly, there's been a shrinkage in what it is legitimate to recognize, and the predominance of economic thinking and the commercialization of everything, I think, is perhaps what we're getting a reaction to, and it's extremely interesting. And I'm not surprised, but I think it, again, I think it does ask us to deal with both a level of particularity and a level of generality. I think it's quite a complicated thing that's beginning to come through right now. Thank you.
It's me again. Yeah. But I make a good point. I'm talking about different things. I also want to ask about an issue of terminology, because in terms of culture, I hear artists talked about a lot, which I think is fantastic, of course. But I think when I think of culture, I think of zoos and aquariums and national parks and heritage sites and libraries and cultural workers. I think of people in advertising, designers, fashion designers, etc. And I think that it becomes extremely difficult in the cultural field because I never know who we're actually talking about, because all of those different people have very different needs and concerns. So I think it's helpful for us to understand, are we talking about the art, like, are we talking about all of the above or some of the above? Do we put sport in there? Do we put nature in there? Are we talking about environment when we talk about culture? What are we talking about?
Peter from Budapest Observatory. And well, the conversation which is going on somehow elicits the skeptic in me, because I as an observatory, we are an interface. We try to connect academia with practice, with stakeholders and policy, but we have, well, then several sides. And well, the skeptic side of me somehow to recall the dichotomy which was raised between open-ended and purpose-driven. Somehow it seems to me that we are too much becoming a purpose-driven exercise. All these sides or against the curiosity. That, for example, when we mentioned the impact research, which by definition sound to be only for advocacy, for justifying. But for me also the impact research is to find out things, to explain, to understand things. So in a way, instead of just going for advocacy, we should also try to understand things, because there are too many simplifications. Like, for example, these researches on the health. Well, also we have been studying it, and we also discovered that those people who are healthier, also in a hidden way, so implicitly, they are those who go to theater. And it's not necessarily the other way around, that you go to theater and then you live longer. And just to cite one example. So instead of just looking for arguments to weapons or the language to win the other, also we should. I mean, this project should have an agenda of trying to find out things. Just one thing. In my country, for example, which is Hungary, is a very divided country, and it's divided culturally. It means that culture is not only on the right side. So also, culture is used as an instrument, and its impact is being measured for reactionary purposes too. So that's one more point which warns us not to become too syndicalist, not just to be an advocacy group for the sector.
I'm just trying to think through two of the clear demands that I hear in this section. One is about having more refined indicators to measuring things that can appeal to the broader qualities and values that we subscribe to and wish to define. Another is also an appeal for a more unified theory. And I agree that this is paradoxical at one level, but also symptomatic of the same paradox itself. Symptomatic in the sense that we live in an age of complexity and multiplicity, which on the one hand has produced a shrinkage of what is recognized as culture, as Philip has mentioned, but it's not shrinkage in the sense that things are less. It's shrinkage in the sense that they've broken down to smaller parts. And those smaller parts are more diverse, and so we are confronted by the challenge of multiplicity. And that challenge of multiplicity also disrupts two things. One, the capacity to judgment. How do you compare like with unlike? And then how do you integrate that into a unified system? So, in a sense, one of the sort of lessons that I'm learning from this discussion is that on the one hand we want to be able to be more precise in measuring the value of things, but then there's the bigger question of how do we then relate those parts together into a broader narrative that can show a more coherent picture. But this is almost a utopian wish, because as we're aware, we are, right now, Europe is confronting, of course, this vast issue of the refugee crisis, and one of the question is at what point is a number too big, for accommodation? And similarly, at a cultural level, we're at a point when we say, at what point can we deal with too much culture? And so this is quite confrontational for all of us in terms of how we also address our own anxieties and fears about difference, both in terms of qualitative difference, but also of scale. And I think part of the crisis that we're in is this crisis of dealing with multiplicity and our attitude towards the process of fragmentation and then reintegrating things back into some sort of comprehensible system.
Just following what you said, I'm sorry to introduce again two other outside concepts. This is the thing about integration and development. I am also living in the poor suburbs of Marseille since 26 years, so I'm confronted every day with this second, third, fourth generation of immigrated people who are somehow forced to integrate in a development model. And I think innovation and creativity cannot follow the integration and the development model. Development is, of course, oriented. This is our way of being developed. And integration is very contradictory with the idea of cultural diversity. I am the head of the expert panel of the International Fund for Cultural Diversity at UNESCO, which is a global thing. We work with countries like Mongolia or very different places. And we always confront this idea that what we call innovation and creativity is linked to a very specific model of development and integration and homogeneization. And I'm not sure that we have to participate to that and that our discussion has to participate to that. This is why the political frame is still very weak, and I think we stakeholders, we cannot advance on political definition without refreshing the theories. I completely agree with Luca on this lack of theory, that we don't have the tools, actually, because we need to translate these tools in political statements and to political positions, and this is very much needed. If we don't do that, we'll be also responsible for violences, and it's already happening. Just to remind you that the Culture Commission of the European Parliament has as many members, but the six French members, two of them are from the right side, one is from the Socialist Party, and three of them are from the National Front. So the issue of this cultural control, what they call culture innovation and diversity, is, like Peter said, is very problematic, and we have to answer to that. This is what we are to confront today.
that fits very well with what I was going to try to say. I think a word that's implicit and missing is accountability, because it's not just who each of the silos try to communicate with, it's who each of them is accountable to. So an academic may be accountable to peers who understand the language and assess the quality, but who are they accountable to outside? What is democratic accountability for a publicly funded, obscure contemporary artist? Is an interesting issue. For me, the other drivers that are important are the demand for evidence-based policy. So what is the evidence? We all make extraordinary claims. These papers are full of implicit claims. Culture can make positive identities. Evidence for any of these romantic claims is very difficult. I think the request for evidence is often a neoliberal secret attack on the whole function, and even if you produce evidence, people don't believe it. So I think values-based policy and practice is at least as important as evidence-based. So that's why we need to go back to the theory. It's what are the values underlying the policies. So for example, in the Hungarian example, unless you have a set of human rights-based values, you can't choose between a reactionary, intolerant culture and a human liberal culture. So I think I think the problem for academics may be that this is an affirmative process we need. We need to say these are the positive values that we all share, whereas the instinct is to critique the ideological load underlying a lot of how these values play out. But we need both. We need critique and we need affirmation.
I try maybe. There are some. Well, in fact, last one, perhaps.
It's on, yeah. I will be a little bit provocative and insert a thesis that we are in a situation in many member states in Europe that where culture policy is mostly too big. Cultural policy is too big. Why? First, culture as a fact, the value system, the belief, the knowledge system of a social order is to the same also culture as something that is good for everywhere. And this is and should be promoted. Secondly, it makes it easy, this situation, this makes it easy for all to make apple pie statements. For culture is good, culture policy is good. Third, it ignores that other value systems exist outside culture, in science, in whatever, and the economy even, because it claims that these are cultural also. So this is both, it's inside and outside. Another aspect which I would like to put the finger on is no cultural policy can address the wide definition we have in terms of culture if we don't speak or understand culture only as a system or a part of society, but as a dimension. So in this situation, of course, many claims occur in a situation where most budgets for culture and the arts in many regions drop down. So this how can in this situation concepts be developed and policy be made? And I really appreciate research on the contribution of culture to well-being or other aspects of our health, as you mentioned, but I'm not sure if this, under the economization of the debate, is another strand of ideology, an apostrophe.
Last intervention.
Yeah, just a short remark on this discussion about authoritativeness, legitimacy, and accountability, which I think indeed also maybe is a connecting theme which might be continued in the next session if it arises from the stakeholders. I wonder whether there it would not be useful to reconnect the end of this debate now with the beginning, when there were words about the world of research and science on the one side and the world of arts and culture on the other, and the problems of communication. Because I think there are some ways that looking at the developments over the past decades in parallel. I mean, say half a century ago, it was widely acknowledged still that within the arts and within the sciences, in the one case you call it creativity, in the other you call it progress and innovation, but that this is a good on its own, and that it doesn't have to justify itself, because the fact that it is internally generated within the arts or within the sciences is proof of the fact that it will be good. This has deteriorated in both areas over the past few decades, and the concerns for directing, for making them policy relevant or giving impact have arisen in both areas. And I think one can see that in both areas there are counter tendencies. They may still be weak, but they are there, and maybe this meeting can be part of that. If you look at the sciences, the creation now almost 10 years ago of the European Research Council is a counter movement. It's a movement towards an institution at the European level where societal impact and relevance should not be a formal criteria, where bureaucrats should not decide, where only the quality of the work and the judgment by peers is relevant. We might think whether similar developments would also not be usefully discussed in the arts and similarly at a European level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that we must finish the session, and let me say that if it has not been perhaps very ordered, but has been quite creative session that is really corresponding to the goal of the session, and we have a lot of ideas on the paper that can be useful for the conclusive tomorrow. Well, thank you very much for your presentation.
I try to summarize some topic of the discussion about creativity. Maybe we can discuss in the yes. Okay. So only topics that's or problematic issue that emerged in the session, yesterday's session and today, about the creativity and innovation. As Peter mentioned, necessity to distinguish creativity and innovations, creativity, valorization and legitimacy, think creativity and new forms of cultural production and valorizations, definition of cultural creativity, necessity to generate new indicators, but also a general theory, the relationship between creativity and territory. So we have to think creativity only in the cities, not in the peripheries, and analyze creativity beyond economic frameworks. That's another thing that's appeared in yesterday and today. So I think there are some topics to develop in the conclusive sessions.
Yeah, but don't forget a lot of the discussion also today by trying to
yes.
No,
Yes.
Tomorrow I put it these topics.
No,
yes. Yes.
And I think it's really important to
I know.
that.
I know.
Because otherwise we lose actually the tenor of what a lot of the discussion has been about.
Absolutely.
Yes,
we will do that.
So I put these topics, but I think I don't know if there are another topics, but I think there are main topics that appear related to creativity. So I put it in a slide, and tomorrow in the conclusive session we discuss this. So okay.
Okay, so thank you, and in half an hour we will have the second session.